Welcome to the Town Builders podcast. I'm your host, Levi Wentz. Town Builders is produced by the National Town Builders Association, implementers of the new urbanism. This episode is brought to you by James Hardie, what the best are made of. James Hardie is America's #1 brand of siding and is a surefire way to elevate your house. Their products are elegant, durable, and they have a variety of styles to fit exactly what you're looking for. To see more and find a local supplier, visit jameshardie.com. Hello friends, today I sat down with Mike Hathorne. Mike is Director of Pre-Development at High Street Real Estate. He's an educator and urban strategist who has spent the last 30 years trying to understand why the American housing market does what it does. And that pursuit eventually led him to write a book called The Great Housing Reversal and the New American Dream. Mike's core argument is this, that America is not actually experiencing a housing shortage as much as it's experiencing a housing misalignment. The majority of what we build is the single-family detached suburban product that was designed to serve the baby boom generation. But culture and demographics have shifted dramatically. Household sizes continue to shrink, and the silver tsunami of boomers are retiring and looking to downsize out of their suburban homes and move into more walkable communities that better serve their desired lifestyle. But as they look to sell their suburban homes, the subsequent generation of younger buyers is not looking to replace them and buy that suburban house. In fact, Gen X millennials are having less kids, and they too would prefer to live in walkable communities rather than commuter-oriented suburban neighborhoods. And so, we are being left with a glut of product that isn't serving the lifestyle needs of the major market buyer groups, and the product that they do desire is not being supplied to the market. The data seems clear that there's a reshaping of the American housing market underway. And if Mike is right, and we really are at an inflection point, there may be a suburban housing bubble and a huge opportunity for any developers and builders who are ahead of the game, providing diverse product offerings in walkable communities. I think that this is an extremely important conversation to hear and to be a part of. So thank you for listening, and I hope you get as much out of the book as well as the conversation as I did. Well, Mike, welcome to the Town Builders podcast.
Hey, thank you for allowing me this chance to talk.
I'm really, really excited to talk to you. You messaged me a while back on LinkedIn about the book that you wrote, and I think I read the synopsis of that, and I think I sent you back an excited paragraph on LinkedIn of like, this is exactly what I've been thinking about. And then I read the book, and I haven't been able to, it's been the top thing on my mind for the past several weeks, honestly. So it's a really, I think, pertinent conversation for so many people, but especially a developer and builder in the space. It just gave me a lot of wind in the sails for what we're doing.
Good. I'm glad it's doing its job. I mean, that was my intent, was to help people with the same arguments that I was trying to make that spurred the book in the first place. So I'm glad it's assisting you in that way.
Let's start there. So this is The Great Housing Reversal, the book that we're going to be talking about today. What sort of drove you to begin the process of writing this book?
Well, it's a fairly lengthy story that I'll try and condense. My entire life, I have been the type of person that has to know why with everything. I probably drove my parents crazy because I just, somebody says, hey, do this, do that, and I want to know why. And for the past 30 years, I've wanted to understand the housing market and why the housing market does what it does. And, over the course of my 30-year professional career, it has been a pursuit of answering that question. And there's a lot of things that occurred over that time period, but things kind of came to a head last year when I was hired to work for a home builder that was in the process of acquiring about 100 acres of a traditional neighborhood that was already zoned and entitled, and they needed somebody to manage the project that understood what a traditional neighborhood was. And a guy that I had worked with previously lobbied for me and said, hey, this is the guy to do it. And once I started and started digging in, it became clear pretty quickly that the builder didn't understand what it was that they were acquiring. They didn't do any due diligence before I showed up on what a traditional neighborhood was. what the zoning was, what the requirements were. So my first task was, okay, I got to help them understand this. And as I started feeding them, hey, this is what this is what it means, this is what you are expected and required to do as per the zoning and entitlement, it started to freak them out because their history was as a suburban home builder. And what they saw was a lot runway. They saw the entitlement, saw the number and went, wow, this is amazing. We've got, over 1,000 lots that will keep us busy for years. But they didn't understand what the delivery required. It required them to deliver multiple housing types. It required them to deliver mixed use. And they made it very clear that they viewed these requirements as a burden. And so I had to figure out, okay, how do I help them understand that this is an opportunity? It's not a burden, it's an opportunity. And I went about that task by trying to show them in terms of demographics, socioeconomics, the trends that are occurring, that what this actually positions them for is to be out in front of where development needs to go and what the market both wants and needs. And the book was really kind of the delivery mechanism of this, where my intent was never to deliver a book. It was to, I like to couch it as my Jerry Maguire manifesto of this is what our business model needs to be.
Right.
And I want you to see this as a true opportunity. To kind of wrap the story up, it turned into me working my way out of a job with that home builder because they still couldn't grasp it. But it has led to my next opportunity. And my next opportunity is working for a developer that understands this, gets it. They've been doing it for 20 plus years. So I don't have to fight. I have been fighting for most of my career in terms of the position of it's not only the right thing to be doing, it's what the market is screaming for. And here's the evidence to support that.
Right. So you're arguing for a specific development type, but you make some pretty bold claims throughout the book. One of the big ones being that we actually don't have a housing shortage, but it's more so a housing mismatch. And I think this was one of the big things that struck me. I mean, it's on every news cycle that's going around, we're in a housing shortage. And so walk me through why this is a structural misalignment of supply and not just a housing shortage. Or could it be both?
Well, it is both. I mean, if you just look at it in terms of general raw numbers, in terms of households and the number of housing units, there is a shortage. But it does not tell the full extent of the story in terms of what the shortage actually is. And that's my argument in terms of mismatch. When you dig into the issues like I did to try and make the position, it really boils down to understanding the relationship between housing types, household types, and the associative life stages that are associated with the household types transitioning from single to young married couple to family with small kids, larger kids, empty nesters, and senior living. When you start to do the comparative analysis of the housing that's necessary to address those needs in terms of household types and what the market actually consists of today, that's where the mismatch occurs. We have a system, and I try to lay this out in the book, that we have a system that since World War II has primarily spit out housing for what was the majority household type of two parents and children, and how demographics have shifted and household types have become a lot more diverse. The number of single households or households with two adults and no children, the number of children, the age at which people are marrying. I mean, all of these things have an impact on the deliverable of the container or the housing type. And not to mention the affordability issue, not to mention the glut that we're seeing materialize at the top end of the market with seniors that have homes that were built for traditional families who are now a minority in this country as opposed to the majority. And so there's nobody to come in and backfill for these suburban single family detached homes because of want, need, and affordability. So that's kind of the crux of the argument in terms of the mismatch.
I want to walk through this just to make sure, we're following the logical pathway here. So the American housing market really got reshaped post World War II with the baby boom and the expectations of, suburbia and the American dream of everyone can have their own suburban lot and raise their family and have your suburban school and all that good stuff. That's what shaped the American housing market to this point. And you're going to be arguing for something alternative to that development style. What are some of these specific things that have happened in the average American household? Because one of the things that you brought up was just the demographic shifts. I know one that we reference often back in the 70s, nearly 50% of households were made up of families, parents with children. And now I think that's a third or maybe even fourth largest demographic buyer group at around like 15 to 17%, somewhere in there. What are some of these demographic data or what are other trends that they're kind of teeing up this conversation, this shift?
Well, it's what makes up a given household and what the spread is in terms of those household types. And what I'm arguing for is that we have a disconnect between the relationship of those household types statistically and the ability to deliver for those household types in terms of the housing that's necessary. For example, if you're let's say either a single person household or simply a two-person household, the demographics of a single person household right now sit at around 29%. Two-person household is around 37%. A traditional family household, if I remember the number correctly, is like 17%. Yet that is the primary driver just based on what we've been doing in terms of what the deliverable is. And that doesn't even account for example, square footage. The amount of square footage per person in a household has consistently gone up while the size of a household has gone down. And then when you look at the runway of how land has been zoned and entitled in this country, and this is where part of the problem comes into play and where my argument relative to the issue is the market is oversaturated for the single family detached home. Depending upon where you are in the country, single family zoning covers between 70 and 90% of residential land. Using the markets that I'm most familiar with, in Northwest Arkansas right now, that number's at about 73%. Where I came from in Utah, it's 88%. That's a problem because what we need is a more diversified delivery of housing types, which we don't have the ability to meet because the market has been, or the system, the policy system has been streamlined to deliver single family detached homes on, a multitude of different lot sizes. That doesn't work for everyone.
Do you have any data or information on, the statistic that you just shared of 70 to 90% of land use is zoned for single family detached residential? Now, of course, single family detached residential is the least dense. It's of course going to use the most land. How far are we off on actual units, of producing? Because if 17% of the market is actual, let's say the traditional suburban style family, how much of the unit types of the residential units that we're building in America are single family detached versus multifamily versus maybe an attached single family product?
Well, I think that's part of the disconnect in terms of how we're looking at the information. Before I left Utah, the governor of the state of Utah had made an objective that statewide we needed to deliver 35,000 homes within a 3-year period. but he was not speaking in terms of, it was just the raw number.
Yeah.
This was actually before the, writing the book. I was making the argument in social media saying, look, it can't be a raw number issue, because if we look at what the market is today and what the market requires based on demographics, we have to diversify that delivery. Now, that's going to change based on market. The needs in where you are in Idaho are going to differ in terms of mass quantity in relation to other parts of Idaho or other states that are proximate to Idaho. Those numbers in Northwest Arkansas aren't as drastic as Utah, but the way that it's viewed through certain lenses is certainly the same. One of the things that's going on here in Arkansas, well, in Northwest Arkansas, is there has been a very concerted effort to define and determine a regional growth strategy. And they've been very particular in terms of doing it within the context of, thankfully, the kind of thinking that I'm trying to draw attention to, looking at it through a lens of housing type, household type, how those housing types get delivered in terms of the pattern, because that's another part of this. It's not just delivering different housing types based on the Euclidean model of condensed pod here, condensed pod there, because that creates other problems. It's really about the delivery mechanism that we espouse within the NTBA of mixed housing in terms of mixed residential, trying to deliver mixed use so that you're delivering daily needs and you're addressing the spectrum of socioeconomics within a neighborhood and providing the opportunity and choice of walking, biking, and automobile.
Town Builders is brought to you by Brett Jones, PA. Brett is a practicing land use lawyer in Florida, and as a patron and advocate for new urbanism, he leverages his background in corporate law and personal development experience to help landowners and developers get entitlements and cut through red tape to build human-centric, walkable neighborhoods. Visit brettjonespa.com to find out more. Okay, so a couple more pushbacks here, because I'm tracking with you and I agree with you, but the things that don't make sense to me are this. Demographics are our destiny, supposedly, and the demographic trends of what's going to happen to our housing market as we built our whole housing market around the boomers. People have known that there's going to be a transition coming, yet 70 to 90% of residential land is still zoned for this one product type that we created to serve this generation. It seems so obvious why I was so excited and animated when you first reached out, and why this has been on my mind is that this has just seemed sort of obvious anecdotally of what we talk about in our office that led us to design the type of neighborhood that we're building here at Woodbury. But my question is, like, why is no one else doing this? Because it seems so obvious. If you just look at something as obvious as demographic data, not to mention the cultural data and surveys, that you have a lot of different data within your book, it's all pointing to the same thing. So my first question is, why is no one else doing this? And alternatively, if the market is shifting, the market is still buying what builders are putting out there. D.R. Horton wouldn't be building what they're building if people aren't buying it. So the market is still responding to what's being built, what's being given to the market. And I think this lends credence to the debate around, well, there actually is just a housing shortage. We just need to supply whatever you want to the market and it will get sapped up.
Well, I guess the way I would explain that is, from a general platform of development, to have a development project actually get off the ground, there has to be an alignment between market, policy, and economics. And if you kick any one of the legs of those stools out, it's not going to happen. So I think that's an important part of this, is understanding what's actually necessary. And then you look at it within the context, you look at your question within that context. Is there a market for this? There is absolutely a market, and it's a pent-up demand in terms of the market. So market's not the issue. And there's all sorts of statistical data that frankly comes from very reliable sources. Where I went for my information was the National Association of Realtors.
Mm.
They don't have skin in the game in terms of this versus that. They're just trying to understand from the perspective of the realtor, what does the market want? What should we understand in terms of trends? And what the market is telling them through their surveys is the market wants what it is that the NTBA delivers. They want walkable communities.
And I want to get into defining that a little bit more in a bit here.
With policy, that's a hang up because clearly policy favors the suburban Euclidean model.
Yeah.
And that's why we have this glut of future supply around the country. And what it is that we do as national town builders, what it is that we deliver from a policy standpoint, we're swimming upstream. We all have stories about how hard it is to get through the process to deliver what it is that the market is actually streaming for. So what are the implications of that? The implications are excess time, which equates to cost, which equates to expense back to the market. If we can get through that process and do it to where we can be affordable at the outset of the delivery of the project, what happens? We have a limited supply and a screaming demand that then takes a project that should be affordable and makes it unaffordable very, very quickly. So there's where we have some of the challenges as we look at the market policy aspect.
Right.
The economics can be a challenge up front. How do you get funding for a project that doesn't meet this Euclidean model? That can be an issue. It can be overcome. We're all doing it. On the consumer side, up front, it can be an issue because out of the gates, you don't necessarily have comparables. But once you get through those first sales, you have the comparables and the machine is set up to work and operate. But the argument that gets made a lot of times is what it is that we're delivering is neighborhoods for the rich, and that's not the intent.
Mm-hmm.
The intent becomes one of unaffordability because the market supply and demand is out of whack. There's not enough of what we do. And so we become salmon swimming upstream in terms of trying to do it.
And so that's sort of your argument then for why other builders haven't. I mean, it goes back to the builder that you started the story with, which is I build this product type. I am a builder and I do this. And anything outside of anything, mixed use, commercial, outside of my normal purview is just like I can't even make sense of.
Right. And the interesting thing about that argument is if you want to straddle both sides of the market argument, which some do very successfully, is you can be in both camps. If you want to still build your suburban homes because you say there's a market for it, you can keep doing that. In this particular instance with the builder that I was working for, they simply didn't want to go through a retooling process. They're like, hey, we're a one-trick pony. This is what we do. And, the feedback that I've gotten since I've moved on is that they actually walked away from the project. They decided they didn't want to go through and close on the deal because it was too much for them.
Well, and this leads to your second point and kind of the economics of town building. Oftentimes you're investing a lot more capital up front just through the policy, getting entitlements for projects can be more difficult. It can take longer periods. So more risk, more exposure. You're putting a lot more money up front to make sure that it's planned right and done right. And then in some instances, just everyone does it a bit differently. But what we're doing, it's like trying to get amenities in early. You don't want to be the park to be the last thing that you build because then you can't sell it. So you kind of trying to put your best foot forward and show this different idea of what you're doing and try to get enough critical mass out there so that you can attract the market. Because one of the things that we're dealing with is that what we're building is very different than anything else people are familiar with in the area. So we've sort of been just stretching and reaching for this point of getting critical mass so people can even have an idea of this vision, of what we're trying to create.
Yeah, in a new market, that is absolutely a challenge, is if there's not familiarity, if they don't have any regional comparables, it can be difficult. I mean, occasionally you'll have, around the country, you'll have historic precedents. You'll have pockets of neighborhood that are pre-World War II that you can point to say, hey, what we're trying to deliver new is reflective of neighborhood X, which is historic.
Yeah.
So that you can at least start to paint the picture of that relationship of a place where it's not just block after block of a singular housing type, which delivers a monoculture. It's, being able to mix housing on the same block, on the same street, lot to lot, depending upon how diversified you are comfortable in the delivery.
And for any skeptics listening, I'll just say the market has responded a lot faster than I would have even thought. But certainly what exists is some higher barriers to entry just in the policy and planning aspects of it.
Yep.
As you said, it's a little bit of swimming upstream.
Yes.
So I wanted to get into one of the big portions of your book, the Great Senior Short Sale. Can you sort of describe what you mean by that term?
Yeah. So that's a phrase that was coined by Professor Arthur C. Nelson, who is a professor at the University of Arizona. And he has been tracking this for, a good 15 years. Well, probably longer than that. 15, well, say 15 to 20 years. He's been the lone voice in the wilderness saying, hey, folks, there's this demographic shift that's coming that we need to understand. Otherwise, it's going to overtake us. I've heard other people refer to it as a silver tsunami. And the premise is that as the baby boomers, they have been a demographic majority since inception. So they're kind of like the pig and the python moving through the python. And they're now at the back end demographically aging into seniority. They are this critical mass in their housing type that's creating this problem at the top end of the market where they need to work on downsizing. And the premise of the Great Senior Short Sale is there will be a heavy supply, an oversupply of single family detached suburban homes from the baby boomers that will lack the ability to be absorbed back into the market. One, out of cost, and two, out of a lack of interest. Because coming in behind them, going Gen X down, are households that are saying that's not what we want. So they are then in a position of having to either age in place or sell at a heavy discount and having to walk away from what was their nest egg to be able to go into the sunset, we'll say.
Yeah, so they may not be able to sell their nest egg, everything that they've planned their retirement on. The market might not be there to buy it.
Yeah.
But there's also this presupposition, right, that the boomers are moving through and they're at retirement age. The silver tsunami is coming. Historically, it's not too uncommon for elderly people to age in place and die in their homes. So what's the data behind the preference for boomers, and why is this demographic group looking to change housing markets at this stage of their life? And I guess lots of this presupposes that there's actually a supply there also for them to move into.
Well, the interesting thing about these consumer preference surveys that the National Association of Realtors has been doing, it's actually showing that what baby boomers and what seniors want, they want walkable communities too. And part of what's driving that is the ability to age in place and to do it gracefully, to do it without the need of a car, to be able to walk to their daily needs. The ability to have access to things within a walkable proximity. I come across people all the time that are kind of in that crossroads where they're trying to figure out, what do I do? I'm in a position where my health has certain requirements of me that, maybe I can't, I'm in a position where I can't drive anymore as a senior. And what that means in terms of a person's ability to care for themselves without assisted help. In an environment where you're proximate to things, it provides you an opportunity to live longer in place without then having to seek assisted care to keep going. And I think that's part of what's driving that in terms of the senior preference for that. As you go into, we'll call it senior active adulthood, it's one of having access and proximity to things that help to keep you active. So it's not necessarily about simply aging in place, but it's one of being able to age gracefully by having access to things that in a drivable suburban setting, you simply have to get into a car to go anywhere.
Right. Maybe you struggle with this too, but the word walkability is something that I use on a daily basis, and I'm sure you use, and it's talked
Yep.
about in the NTVA and in New Urbanism and this sort of thing. My question is always like, what does the average person mean when they say, I want to live in a walkable community? Because I was just having this discussion with my last guest about agrihoods, where agrihoods sort of became this like coin term and everyone wanted to live in an agrihood, and there were developers or builders putting up neighborhoods that had like a garden box in the front yard, and it was like you're now part of an agrihood. These terms can get stretched to mean so many different
Yeah.
things. You can have a walking trail that cuts along the perimeter of your development and it's now a walkable community. So my question is walkability the term that the general market uses to describe what we mean by walkability? Is it the same term, or should we be talking about this differently?
Well, unfortunately, I think when walkability is brought up, it's done so within the context of urban planning,
Mm-hmm.
and which oftentimes gets labeled as being something of distance. It's walkability from an urban planning standpoint is defined as a quarter mile from center to edge. Well, that's a pretty boring definition. And I think walkability is much greater than just one of distance. If you haven't yet, I'll recommend it. Jeff Speck's book, Walkable Cities.
Mm-hmm.
He defines walkability as more than just distance. And it's a function of when you become a pedestrian, is your environment useful? Is it interesting? Is it safe? Is it secure? That adds a different filter to it. The way that I try to position it in the book, and this comes from how I was trying to speak to the requirement of delivering mixed use in this project in Utah as being one of opportunity rather than burden, was trying to take the position of looking at daily needs as an amenity. If you think about mixed use and what it can potentially mean, not kitschy, because I think what Jeff Speck speaks of in terms of use, a walk being useful, it's one of having a destination. I lived in a community in Utah that was very walkable, and you could go out at any point of the day and you see people walking. But in terms of having a destination to walk to, it was somewhat limited. People walked because it was part of the culture of the community. And yes, it was interesting. I mean, you would see new things all the time. And yes, it felt very safe because the environment was one that prioritized pedestrian over the automobile. But in terms of being able to walk to a grocery store, not everybody had that proximity. I actually was fortunate in that I lived about 3/4 of a mile from a neighborhood grocery store, and I benefited immensely from that. So to think of it in terms of the walk being useful,
Hmm.
what sort of needs are being met? Can you walk to work? Can you take care of medical needs? Can you walk to the doctor? Can you walk to the grocery store? Can you walk to the hardware store? Those are some key things that are addressing daily needs that, if you live in a place where you have that ability, and it's not about being anti-car, because a car is part of daily life and it's going to be, but it's about being able to choose. Can I walk? Can I bike? Can I get in the car and can I take care of these things and do it in a fashion that provides choice and opportunity? And based on household type and based on demographic, that can either be more or less important. For a senior, it can be imperative that things are being addressed that way. that you have the ability, because you have a medical condition that doesn't allow you to drive. Well, if you can walk to a grocery store, you're no longer stuck. You can take care of your needs and be self-sufficient without the need of assistance. That's a life-altering thing to have if your other choice is, I've got to get a ride, somebody's got to do it for me, or I've got to go into a situation where my living is assisted.
Right. Yeah, and I think that oftentimes when walkability comes up, I'm just assuming this of other people, but I think what gets mentioned is, an active lifestyle and maybe some freedom, as you're talking about, so seniors aren't stranded. One of the anecdotes that I heard recently that I just found so compelling was actually from Jan Schramek, who was episode 1 of this season. But he was discussing living in an urban area, and he had a routine each morning of taking his 2-year-old to the coffee shop. They'd walk to the coffee shop together, and it was a 5-minute walk, and the 2-year-old would play along the way and jump off the park bench. And, it was very interactive the whole time. So there's this like intriguing, playful journey to a destination, as you're talking about. And then they ended up moving into a more suburban setting where they had to drive. The closest coffee shop was a 10-minute drive away, and he'd load his 2-year-old into the car and drive to the coffee shop for 10 minutes. And he's like, it took all the joy out of, this amazing morning routine that we had. It just took all joy out of it, because now it's a
task.
instead of the playful, intriguing journey that was like the 2-year-old's exploring and playing. It's now you have to load into the car and you have to sit there, and it's really boring. And then you have to unload out of the car and then go in and then load back into the car and drive. And it's just not worth it at that point, So that sort of just intriguing aspect of what a walk can be and the unexpected playfulness that can happen. It sounds so mundane, but that was just like so compelling to me. I think because I have a 2-year-old also.
Well, I mean, what it's pointing out, we have focused a lot on the structure of things and haven't really talked about the social outcomes, the benefits on a social level, which is what's being reflected there. The opportunity for informal meetings just is completely incinerated when you have to get into a car and what you're doing turns into a task as opposed to an adventure. I can totally relate to that. Being able to say, you know what, I want to go on a walk. I added utility to walking to the grocery store because it was proximate and because the walks were interesting and I felt safe doing it. I turned what otherwise would have just been a recreational walk into checking a box, but accomplishing 2 things at once. There's a lot of benefit to that on top of the physical activity. We haven't even touched that.
Right.
There are so many benefits to doing what it is that we want to do and what we want others to do and have it be easier to do, as opposed to simply putting blinders on and continuing to oversaturate the market with what the market doesn't necessarily need at this point. It needs something different to fulfill that supply gap in terms of delivery.
That was another thing that came up that I hadn't heard before, but another argument for walkability from the financial perspective of, I want to say you had some stat that was like homeowners that live in a walkable community spend like 20% less. And you had this list of, what was that? Because I think that was one of the, I was listening on Audible, and I think I was like, no way that's true.
Well, I mean, it's a lot of it is actually common sense. When you think about the costs that are associated with an automobile and what happens as you start to pull back on the requirement associated with that in terms of just the expenses of the automobile, having the opportunity of going from 2 cars to 1 car to no car. I know people that are able to live with 1 or no cars. And there's a common sense that's associated with that from an economic standpoint. But then you carry that into health. What are the costs that are associated with health that are tied to movement when your car is, in essence, a prosthetic for getting things done? People that live in a walkable environment are statistically healthier than those that don't. I wish I had all the numbers pulled up so I could just start rattling them off. But what I would offer is, if you think about it anecdotally in terms of what it means when you take walkability and you translate it into finance. Again, Jeff Speck is probably the best source of this in terms of his book, Walkable City, because he makes every argument that you can make for why walkability is the way to go. And his book really gets into details associated with the economic benefits at the household level and why that should be important.
Friends, great towns don't happen by accident. The places that we remember, the ones that people love for generations, are built with intention, craft, and a deep understanding of how people actually live. New towns need a strong vision from day one, but also the flexibility to evolve as families grow, lifestyles and businesses change, and communities mature over time. Townright Studio brings that level of craft and long-term thinking to every project they touch. From master planning and entitlements to town architecture, renderings, and illustrations that help bring that vision to life. If this podcast has inspired you to think about building places worth caring about, we encourage you to reach out to Townright Studio and explore opportunities to partner. Learn more at townrightstudio.com. That's TOWNWRIGHTSTUDIO.com. Now back to the show. And it just opens up all these possibilities. Walking is this very human thing, and it limits the scope of how far we can go and how we interact with a place. And I can imagine that Moscow, where we live, it's a small enough town to where you could go to the grocery store and it's not uncommon to run into someone you know. And I think those are some of the anecdotes that people talk about, I think, when moving to a small town is, oh yeah, I run into people that I know at the grocery store here or there. You're running into people around town because it's a small enough space, but how much more is that accelerated on this village scale or traditional neighborhood scale when you're walking around and you get to know your neighbors because you all have the same sort of daily routines. There's not 5 different grocery stores around town where you might never run into your next door neighbor. I've had this conversation with lots of people that moved into the pocket neighborhoods we developed. They're like, I lived next to my neighbor for 8 years. I never once met them. I don't know what their name is. They never once interacted because they just drove into the garage each day and there wasn't a destination within the neighborhood to walk to, and just very suburban.
That's a very important point, Levi. When you're in a drivable environment, it does become one of come home, pull into the garage, and where's there to walk? What reason do you have to be out in the neighborhood? Right.
Maybe you go on a walk to be active.
Yes, but you're kind of going against the grain of how that neighborhood is designed, because it's not designed necessarily at a human scale. It's designed at an auto scale. So once you're outside, think about what this means in terms of a mixed residential community and the different household types, the different people. It's not a monoculture. It's not like, if it's a quote unquote family neighborhood at its impetus, as kids age out, it becomes a bit of a social wasteland. Whereas if the housing is diverse and mixed, you're addressing this opportunity of meeting people that are maybe different from you in terms of age, finance. I've written about a neighbor of mine that, fortunately, I lived in a neighborhood in Utah that was mixed residential, and it allowed the demographics to mix. And I facetiously talk about this in terms of where people shop. I view myself as a Target guy. He's a Nordstrom's guy. He could have lived anywhere in the valley behind gates, but he lived 3 doors down from me. And I had a particular need at work where I wanted to get some real-time aerial photographs. He owned an airplane, and I went down the street, asked him if he would take me up in his airplane so I could get some aerial photographs. He's like, when do you want to go? In a monoculture, I don't have access to this man and his generosity in terms of providing that to me. That's a benefit from the availability of people that are in a different spot than I am within my particular life stage. I love that. I love that opportunity. And that's one of the benefits of a mix of housing types is you have that stratosphere of diversity on top of the opportunity of not having to move as your needs change. If you're in a monoculture and your housing needs change, you are leaving your neighborhood. You're going somewhere else. You don't have the ability of being able to move down the street. Where I lived in Utah, I lived in the same community and moved 5 times, but I didn't leave my community. I may have moved into a different neighborhood that's adjacent, but I stayed in roughly the same area, had access to the same people for, almost 20 years. It was remarkable. And I'm now living in a place where I'm now an empty nester and I've downsized from a 3,000 square foot house in Utah to a 750 square foot apartment. And I'm ecstatic. I'm very grateful for that opportunity on a social level.
Yeah, this diverse environment that you're describing just rings back to the bust that you're describing in the suburban market, which is just this monoculture. Not that it has a single use, a single person can live in a 3,000 square foot house, but it was designed for a unique purpose. And that purpose is aging out and changing their desires now. And so building a town or neighborhood, talking about building sustainably is building a place that can serve multiple different demographics, multiple different economic segments of the market as well. I found that really fascinating, some of the data that you were sharing about the economic success of less well-off demographics simply being in proximity to wealthier demographics, what that does to the, I guess, psychology. A little bit of rich dad, poor dad vibe.
Yeah, that was a Raj Chetty study. He runs a think tank at Harvard and had done a study on pulling Facebook data, 73 million Facebook users, and trying to understand the relationship in terms of who knows who. And based on that relationship, what the economic benefit to folks at a lower socioeconomic level was when they had relationships with people at a higher socioeconomic layer. Raj Chetty was one of the keynote speakers at CNU 34 here in Northwest Arkansas. And he spoke about another study that he did. At the time, he didn't have a working knowledge of new urbanism, but he had decided to do a study on the impacts of the Hope 6 program that the federal government enacted. I think it was back under the Clinton administration when Henry Cisneros was the Secretary of HUD. And what he did is he looked at the impact of people that lived in these Hope 6 communities that were very heavily influenced and designed around principles of new urbanism and walkability and what that impact was, and showed an extremely strong correlation in terms of the ability of people to lift themselves out of poverty because they were living in a much better environment relative to what Hope 6 was replacing. And, for listeners that don't necessarily know what the Hope 6 program was, the program was designed to replace federal housing, which was done in Cabrini Green or Pruitt-Igoe style, large concentrations of multi-story buildings, and putting it in more of a walkable neighborhood platform, and what the impact of those that lived in those communities. And what I drew from that study, the way that he described it and what the outcomes were, was the longer somebody lived in that environment, the greater the impact on them in terms of getting out of poverty. So children, starting at a younger age, the impact was greater with a child than it was maybe a teenager or even an adult, because it was changing habits and behavior and creating a different level of exposure. I mean, think of what it means to the person that happens to know somebody that needs to find a job, your social network. I mean, the ability to lift yourself is far greater if your exposure to people in places that you might not otherwise have access provides extremely valuable benefit if that's achievable.
Right. Is this Hope 6 program, was this a one-off community that was built, or is this still ongoing?
That's a question I don't necessarily have the answer to.
Because it sounds extremely promising.
Oh, it is so promising. And the thing that was so exciting about it in terms of him presenting it at CNU 34, and then hearing the backstory that before he was asked to be a keynote speaker, he really didn't have a working knowledge of new urbanism. And so to put the pieces together to get further exposure and to understand the depth of what went into the redesign of the platform under Henry Cisneros, it shed a lot more light in terms of, what the objectives were and whether those objectives were actually met. That's, I think, is one of the major takeaways. I don't know that the Hope 6 program is as active because as presidents come and go and Henry Cisneros was there under Clinton, and
Okay.
I don't know that the program stayed in place as those folks changed in Washington.
Well, I think it's, maybe even the same thing for the NTBA, but, Seaside got started back in the 1980s, and there's a lot of those early developments that are, reaching full maturity at this point. And there's a lot more data behind traditional neighborhood development,
Yeah.
certainly from a modern standpoint now. And I'm going to guess that there's going to be more of a flood now that there's good models to follow. And we actually have data coming out of, okay, well, so maybe something similar with the Hope 6 program, now that, the data has actually been able to be collected on it, maybe it has more legs underneath it to keep going.
Yeah. One of our fellow NTBA members, Daniel Wright, has done a couple studies that were funded by NTBA. He did a study of Burkdale Village in North Carolina and a study of Norton Commons in Prospect, Kentucky. I actually devoted a chapter to his study of Norton Commons in the book, where he's studying the economic pattern of Norton Commons versus neighborhoods that are outside but proximate to Norton Commons, to show the tremendous value and wealth that's generated by the community. He had an opportunity to speak at CNU 34 as well. There's so much support for what it is that we're doing. And it is so difficult as a passionate NTBA guy to know that what we're doing is not the norm. We are salmon swimming upstream, but there is so much support and evidence that what we're doing is the right thing to be doing on a myriad of levels. It's, yes, there's financial benefit to this. It is absolutely something that is profitable, can be profitable. But I don't think there's anyone that wants to hold their cards to the vest in the NTBA. I think we would love for this to be everywhere.
Right.
That every neighborhood that's getting built in Moscow, Idaho is similar to what it is that you're doing with Woodbury. That would be tremendously beneficial to the entire market.
It's funny, your book, we shared it with our team, and we've been talking about expanding to other markets. And one of the comments that came up was like, isn't that going to detract from people wanting to move? Because we have a lot of out-of-state people moving into Idaho right now, simply for Idaho. And I think that we're starting to attract some of them with what we're building. But it was like, well, isn't that going to detract, take buyers away from Woodbury? It's like, no, I think that after reading your book, I was like, I think every single town in the country can be building in this style. And there's unlimited demand, seemingly right now for a different way of building. And so I know we're probably preaching to the choir mostly, but for any skeptics, they're like, I still don't know what these guys are talking about. It's like, well, read the book. First of all, it's an amazing, it's a very short read. It was very digestible. I love small books. And also just connect with the NTBA because there's a wealth of knowledge behind what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think the thing that part of, I think, where we can go with this argument, I think there's a lot of pushback on growth in general. I know you're experiencing it in Idaho.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how do we stop it? How do we shut the door? And what needs to be more commonly understood is growth is going to happen. We have to simply accept that. What we need to understand and help people hold on to is answering the question, what kind of growth do you want? And if the growth that people want When you compare and contrast the suburban subdivision model to the traditional neighborhood model, there's overwhelming demand for the traditional neighborhood model. It just has to be more prominent. And to be more prominent, we've got to change systems and policies. The market is there. That is indisputable.
Amen.
It's how do we make it easier to deliver? How do we tweak things within the system, within policy? And it's not just zoning. There are aspects to fire code that are problematic. We've got to address some of the nuances of the economics. I'm of the opinion the economics will fix itself, because if there's money to be made, they will make the adjustments.
Mm-hmm.
Where I feel the heavy lifting needs to be done is with the leg of policy. And how do we turn that 70 to 90% of single family detached zoning that's just sitting out there as future product or inventory, and instead change it into what is frankly the more responsible method for delivering neighborhood and community in this country? Mixed residential, mixed use, walkable. Let's get it done.
Let's get it done. Okay, so in closing here, I want you to paint the picture for us one last time. The full title of your book is The Great Housing Reversal and the New American Dream. So if the old American dream is financial independence and buying your suburban home and good retirement, what's the new American dream?
Generally, what you listed, I don't think that has changed drastically. It's the lens through which we see what the American dream is. The American dream used to be married with children, single family home, 2 cars in the garage. And we have changed as a country. Bottom line, that is not the majority. It's actually the minority in this country. And what people have been clamoring for, and the surveys are proving, is that the new American dream is something that is smaller. It's something that's more experience-based. It's something that provides more access in terms of walkability. And we're not delivering it. So the reversal is trying to get to where we're delivering it, so that we're meeting that new American dream of addressing the needs reframed in terms of what makes for a good life experience.
Wonderful. Well, Mike, I have a lot more questions for you, but I think that's a good place to leave it there. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing about your book. Where can people get connected and find your book?
I self-published it on Amazon, so it's only available on Amazon. It actually speaks to the fact that I had no intent of writing a book. I got done with this manifesto and I'm like, what do I do with this? The home builder doesn't want it, so I self-published it. I've tried to make it very affordable. It's available in Audible very inexpensively. It's available on Kindle very inexpensively. I have continued to write because that experience has kind of spurred me to trying to answer other why questions for myself. And so I have a Substack that I write articles. I'm on a once a week schedule. I publish an article every Monday morning, trying to answer a question for myself, and then I share it. And then I'm on LinkedIn. If somebody wants to reach out to me professionally on LinkedIn, I'm there and I'm certainly available. I want to be a resource for people that see this as doing the right thing.
Well, thank you for writing the book, and thank you for reading it yourself also on Audible. I always appreciate that. So this has been helpful for me, and I'm sure it'll affect a lot of other people as well. So thank you again, Mike, and thank you everyone for tuning in and listening.